Hello, my name is Louie McCurley, and I'm CEO of Pigeon Mountain Industries. I've been in the life safety rope, access, and rescue business for over 35 years, and I'm a self proclaimed rope addict. I'm passionate about sharing and doing whatever I can to support the safe use of ropes for work at height. So recently, I published an update about the publication of ANSI Z459, which is a standard on rope access for work at height. And I invited questions from anybody who might want to talk further about content, concerns, or potential impact of the new standard on their work. I've gotten a few questions, but honestly, the most prevalent theme has been of the generic sort, kind of OSHA, ANSI, how does the Z459 standard fit into regulation as a whole? Is it law? How does it fit with what I'm doing? So I'm going to try and tackle that first. So just to summarize, again, we're talking about this in context of work at height, fall protection, and specifically rope access. Now, on a generic basis, OSHA regulations are there to define minimum safety requirements within a given jurisdiction. Those compare to industry standards in that industry standards are specifications or guidelines that help us measure compliance. Industry best practice falls kind of below that, and that contains the techniques or methods and practices that are used to conduct work. So I want to spend a few minutes just kind of unpacking all of that and talking about each one specifically. So if you work in the United States, you should probably be familiar with OSHA. That's because the Occupational Safety and Health Administration is part of our Department of Labor. And the standards and rules that they write actually carry the weight of law. So OSHA regulations, they're pretty slow to change, but they're very, very enforceable. You can be cited, you will be cited against an OSHA regulation if you're not complying with that. Now, industry standards like the ANSI standard are different in that they're typically more specific. They provide guidance on how to comply with OSHA's standards. So the official standards body in the United States is ANSI, the American National Standards Institute. ANSI standards are overseen by specially approved secretariats that have to follow really explicit rules about things like balance and voting procedures and the process that a document goes through to become a standard. The standards that they write are typically revisited every few years. 5 is kind of a common number. And the point there is that they want to try and stay more current with evolving technology. Now, 5 years is pretty fast. And as we talked about, OSHA regulations don't change nearly that fast. So ANSI standards, while they're not law, they're often a little bit more on the front end of what's happening in industry. So the ANSI standard that covers fall protection is the ANSI Z459 Fall Protection Code. Now, while regulations like OSHA and standards like ANSI form the written parameters of what we do, there's this thing called industry best practice. What is that? Well, that's really just kind of what happens in the field. Industry best practice changes faster even than standards, but it's also less reliable in terms of guidance for what's right and what's wrong. So industry best practice is important because it sort of pushes standards to become better than what they are today. And standards are important in that they push OSHA to come up to the next level. But each of those changes a little bit faster than the other. So let's talk about what each of those means to us in rope access. So a minute ago, we talked about OSHA. I want to go back to that for just a minute. OSHA was established way back when for the purpose of ensuring that employers furnish to their employees employment and a place of employment that are free from recognized hazards that are causing or that are likely to cause death or serious physical harm. That's OSHA. Now, they do that in 2 ways. One is under what they call the specific duty clause. The specific duty clause, there's the specific duty clause and then the general duty clause. Now we're going to go back to the general duty clause further in a second. But the specific duty clause, it basically says, hey, there are some things that we're going to write specific regulation about. And where we, OSHA, do that, you need to follow it as an employer, as an employee. Now, one of the areas where OSHA does cover topics pretty explicitly is in fall protection, because fall protection is one of the top three causes of lost time off work and even death in the workplace. So, according to OSHA regulation, fall protection means any piece of equipment, device, or system that prevents an employee from falling from an elevation or that mitigates the effect of a fall from elevation. Now, well, the term personal fall protection system, it refers to pretty much any system and the components in that system that an employer might use to provide protection from falling or to safely arrest that fall. All of those things are lumped into one. So examples might include personal fall arrest systems, positioning systems, restraint systems. Now, in the 2016 revision of 1910, that's OSHA 1910 subparts D and I. Now, that's the general industry part of OSHA. But in the 2016 revision of subparts D and I, rope access was also acknowledged by OSHA as a form of active harness-based fall protection. Now, in their regulation on fall protection, OSHA outlines some pretty general fall protection principles that we all in fall protection, whether we're doing restraint, positioning, fall arrest, rope access, we're supposed to be abiding by those general principles. And those include things like impact force requirements, auto-locking connectors with 3,600-pound gates, maximum deceleration distances, maximum impact force. Did I already say that? Requirements for prompt rescue, stuff like that. So there are some general things that we all are supposed to be doing. But OSHA doesn't write test methods for us to know whether we're meeting those requirements or not. They write the requirements, but they don't provide training or working guidance, and they don't provide test methods to say you are or you aren't meeting that standard. So how do we evaluate rope access as a work method in the absence of specific OSHA regulation? Well, that's where voluntary consensus standards like ANSI come in. Now, voluntary consensus standards are useful in that they help us to comply with regulation. They're also useful in that they provide guidance where no regulation exists. So with OSHA fall protection regulations being very, very performance oriented and not really saying a whole lot about specific procedures or test methods, and especially with language specific to rope access being notably absent from the OSHA regulation, the Z459 Fall Protection Code, promulgated by ANSI and American Society of Safety Professionals as the Secretariat, provides a baseline for what we use to standardize the work at height. So this information should be looked at as minimum requirements, not the ultimate goal. It's not the perfection, but it's an excellent resource to provide a kind of a minimum guidelines. Now, the standard that's known as ANSI Z459, we call this the Fall Protection Code. There's a lot of different standards within that family. I don't even remember how many at this point. There's probably pushing 20. And they all cover different parts of fall protection. A lot of people think that those standards are specific to manufacturers and that they only provide equipment information, but that's not true. ANSI Z459.1 is a document that's actually specifically intended for use by employers. It's called the Comprehensive Managed Fall Protection Program Guide. And this document can be used to help understand and includes information on different fall protection types, how to choose them, writing work plans, requirements for different types of systems, training, employee selection, a lot of different information that can be of use to employers. Now, there are some other standards that are about systems, and those are primarily for use by qualified persons who are plugging systems together and deciding what constitutes a specific system. So, and then finally, there's other standards that are component standards, and those documents are intended for use by manufacturers so that we can actually certify equipment. Those are test methods and requirements for different components used for fall protection. And systems sometimes also includes, their system standards sometimes also includes test methods. So all of that to say, ANSI Z459.1 is currently the rope access standard that is being managed by the ANSI Z359 Fall Protection Code. Now, in that standard, there is some information for employers, there is some information for qualified persons, and there is some information for manufacturers. But here's the big question that I've been getting since last week when I published information about it being available. Do you have to follow the ANSI standard for rope access? Well, actually, no, you don't. It's called a voluntary consensus standard. Remember, ANSI standards aren't law. OSHA regulation is law. Now, ANSI standards, the reason we call them a voluntary consensus standard is because they're written under what's called a consensus process. What that means is that the groups that write the standards are made up of industry representatives, technical experts, policymakers, people whose collective mission is to try to reach a consensus between various and often wildly varying and wildly differing perspectives on safety matters. That's what the ANSI Z359 Fall Protection Code Committee, who wrote the Z459.1 standard, is. It's a committee made up of representation from different parts of the fall protection industry and including employers, end users, regulatory groups, manufacturers, test houses, all sorts of people from the fall protection and rope access world who are all working together to try to establish practical guidance for appropriate safety for use in rope access work. Now, ANSI standards groups aren't sanctioned by the government and they have no enforcement authority. They are not OSHA regulation. But let's go back to OSHA. In their regulation, in addition to the specific duty requirements like the 3,600-pound gates and the maximum fall arrest impact forces and things like that, in their regulation, they also have kind of a catch-all phrase, which is called the General Duty Clause. Now, the General Duty Clause essentially says, we're not going to make specific rules about every possible situation or condition out there. So the onus is on you, Mr. Employer or Mrs. Employer, to do the right thing. Now, remember, we discussed how OSHA standards just cover the really high-level requirements that employers are supposed to follow for safety. They don't specify how that has to be done. That's left to the employer's discretion. So that said, part of using good discretion is for the employer to consider existing consensus standards. And those existing consensus standards are given pretty high credence by OSHA because of the robust nature of their development process, and because ANSI is the nationally recognized standards organization in the United States. So when a standard is promulgated by the official standards body, ANSI, in the United States, OSHA looks to that, among other things. They're also going to take into consideration other standards and work practices that have been written by industry trade groups, certification organizations, private companies, specific users. But here's the thing. When a work practice or standard, any kind of guidance is developed by a private entity, and perhaps even for the benefit of that entity, they're naturally going to be recognized as being inevitably influenced in a certain direction. That's why the ANSI standards groups have all these rules about having to have a broad representation of people on the committees and having to have an open process for the dialogue in the group. It can't be driven by any one specific interest. It has to be a broad range of interests. So to take that a bit further, if the standards and work practices that a private company or organization writes actually contradicts OSHA regulation, it's going to be a pretty tough sell. And they're certainly not going to be perceived as being more credible than those coming out of a full consensus process in a true standards body. So, to summarize, under OSHA regulation, rope access is considered to be one type of fall protection system. OSHA says some pretty specific things about harness-based fall protection systems, and those specific things do pertain to rope access. The ANSI Z459 Fall Protection Code is not law, but it is a well-recognized and accepted source for information on how to comply with OSHA regulation. Remember, ANSI Z459.1 is part of the ANSI Z359 Fall Protection Code. Work practices that are established by employers and trade groups are useful supplements to this as long as they don't contradict OSHA regulation. So hopefully this has been a little bit helpful. My name is Louie McCurley. I appreciate you joining me today to talk about fall protection and rope access and how we can work safely and be compliant with regulatory requirements. This is kind of the first installment in my effort to address questions or comments that are coming back from the post that I did last week about how the ANSI Z459.1 standard was recently released in the interest of rope access in the United States. So hopefully this has been a useful summary of how OSHA, ANSI, and the Fall Protection Code all work together, and hopefully it provides a bit of a framework for understanding how you can use the ANSI Z459.1 standard to help support your efforts and build a safe, compliant rope access program. If you have additional questions or other things that you'd like for me to address in future versions of this, please post them here on in the comments section, or feel free to contact me directly, and I will be continuing with responding to questions that people have and trying to share additional information as I'm able. Stay safe out there and work hard.